Welcome back, everyone. We're so glad you could join us again for the Grief Healing Telesummit. Top experts share their best holistic healing methods to transform grief into healing and living again. My name is Chelsea Hansen. I'm your host, founder of With Sympathy Gifts and Keepsakes, as well as Global Grace. And we have two special guests for you today, Lisa Williams and Eleanor Haley, and they are the co-authors of the popular blog called What's Your Grief? They both are mental health professionals with over 10 years of experience in grief and bereavement. They both have experienced the death of a parent, and when they went through their losses, they didn't really know what resources were available at that time, and they really felt like they kind of had to fumble through the darkness alone. And later they wondered, well, why should anyone else have to cope alone when so many of the rest of us have been through grief? So for this reason, they are very committed to investigating anything grief-related and to provide a place where people can come together to support and be supported through their blog, What's Your Grief? And specifically, their mission is basically to promote grief awareness, exploration, and expression. So welcome, ladies.
Hi. Thank you. Hi.
Yeah, and we have two ladies on the line, which is kind of unique, so I'm so glad you could both join us. And if one of you wants to go first to just kind of tell us how you got involved in your mission of spreading all this education, or just your work in general. I know you've both been through losses and that kind of stuff.
Hey, this is Eleanor. I guess it's interesting. I ended up in the supporting grievers in a week later my mom died. So my loss didn't actually lead me to the job I've been doing for the last 7 years. Actually, monster.com did. I just sort of ended up there.
Oh.
But I think, with having lost my mom, the people I was working with, the families I was working with, the losses they were experiencing were very sudden and traumatic losses. My mom died of terminal cancer. So while there were a lot of similarities with grief, there were differences just in the way that we have lost loved ones. So I think it helped, and it also, it helped me to help others, and it helped me to deal with my grief just working with others. But it was just kind of a coincidence for me. I think over time, when Lisa and I ended up developing What's Your Grief, that's when my personal loss really sort of started to influence things. But I'll let Lisa tell you about her story before we get into all that.
Sure. So my story is a little different because my dad died when I was still in college. It was the summer after my freshman year in college, and I was only 18. So it really was a time in my life. I think college is, of course, a very formative time for a lot of people, and a really difficult time to be grieving. And I really found that the support I received at the time from many, many well-intentioned people, from social workers to family members to friends, was extremely well-intentioned, but it just wasn't what worked for me. And so I spent a lot of time kind of on my own trying to sort through my grief at that time, and being someone in their early 20s who was grieving. So for me, it was a winding road that brought me to actually working in supporting other grievers. I started out in mental health, doing some other work with troubled youth and teenagers. But ultimately, this was something that had been so formative for me that it really did always interest me in getting back to the idea of working with grief and loss specifically. So I found my way back to the field and have been doing it for quite a while, and really found that, like my own experience of struggling through what was going to work for me, I found that many of the families I was supporting were struggling with the same thing, of figuring out how to find the tools to manage their own grief and that kind of unique grief. So that really inspired us in a lot of ways, which I'm sure we'll talk a little more about. to form What's Your Grief as a blog and a place that could really capture a lot of different ways for different types of people to come and find something that might resonate for them.
Yeah, and your blog is so packed with useful information, so I would definitely encourage the listeners to check it out because it's practical information as well as holistic information, or I should say spiritual creative information. So it's really helpful. Yeah, and ladies, you were going to kind of go over the different ways like your site could help because of the different ways people can grieve, whether, you know, like the overview of the rational, emotional, creative disposition. Yeah, so kind of fill us in on that.
Thanks. Yeah. So just as Lisa just said, when we met at the company we've been working for a while, it was our job to find resources for our families, and we all the time were just scratching our heads saying, you know, I wish there was this, I wish there was something geared a little bit more towards this type of grief, this type of loss, something a bit more specific about this facet. And we were constantly just saying, you know, we could just write something. And a lot of that was just influenced by how we understood ourselves as grievers and what we needed, you know, in those moments. We needed some realistic stuff. We needed some stuff that was, you know, geared toward the way that we cope and the way we grieve. And we were finding that a lot of stuff was just kind of cookie cutter, you know, boxed in, unrealistic or too general for us and also for the families we were trying to support. So we ended up getting together and creating What's Your Grief, just to kind of have something for everybody, you know, in helping themselves to understand how they grieve and helping them understand the different ways to cope, because I think we all, you know, if you're not really accustomed to talking about grief, or if you haven't ever had a significant loss, you know, you think of how do people grieve, you think of the 5 stages of grief, straightforward, you think that's what's going to happen. Or you think of your exposure to, you know, what you've seen on TV or in movies. So we just wanted to create a place where people understood that it's bigger than that, it's more than that. Grieving could be the smallest, most odd things. You know, coping could be the most, you know, outside of the box approach, or it could be, you know, straightforward support group, that type of thing. So when we recognize in ourselves and one another and through our work just how unique the grief experience is, we set out to create something for everyone. So we, you know, and in talking about that, we just want everybody out there who's experienced a loss just to recognize and try and, you know, reflect on the fact that, you know, as a person, you are unique. Each one of us is unique. We have a unique set of qualities and characteristics, strengths and weaknesses. We've all had a unique set of experiences and we have our own worldview, and our understanding and exposure to grief and loss is different, and our coping styles are. So there's no reason to think that we're all going to have the same approach, or what one approach works for someone else will work for you. And then you add that to the fact that no two people experience any loss in the same way. So we may have lost the same person, but we had different relationships with that person. They filled different roles in our lives. And so we, you know, we experienced that loss differently. So individuals, you know, being so unique and loss being so unique, we know that cookie cutter approach won't work. And so that's kind of where we developed our site, which is kind of, like you said, Chelsea, focused around the creative, emotional, and rational ways of grieving. And Lisa's going to talk a little bit just about how to conceptualize, you know, yourself and how to process grief from that viewpoint.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I think when we, from a very general perspective, both an academic perspective and a personal perspective, the idea that we all grieve differently really resonated with both Eleanor and I. But I think what became clearer as we worked together longer, as we talked about this longer, and certainly as we developed What's Your Grief, was really exploring what some of those differences in ourselves really are. And when you brought the telesummit to us, one of the things you talked about was that holistic kind of mind, body, spirit idea when we're thinking about grief. And one of the ways I think we have conceptualized thinking of ourselves in a holistic way is really looking at the fact that all of us have kind of a rational part of ourselves, an emotional part of ourselves, and a creative part of ourselves. And I think all of us certainly have all three of those that comprise our being, but we certainly lean towards one sometimes more than another. So some of us may just be more rational and don't really find ourselves relating as much to the emotional side of our temperament or to our creative side. Those might be less emphasized. And, of course, some people are extremely creative. That's their most dominant part of their brain. That's the way that they operate. And some people, the emotional is really what drives them, and it's really the thing that they identify with the most. But knowing that all of that was within us, one of the things we realized was that in looking for tools for coping with grief and looking for ways to explore our grief, it was helpful to understand that there are different tools that work for different types of people. If you are someone with a rational predisposition, there may be certain resources and certain tools and certain ways of operating and processing grief that may be more helpful for you than for someone who's extremely creative. And the same goes for someone extremely creative or extremely emotional. So for us, that became important to our blog posts and to really thinking about the different ways we were approaching this, of making sure that we were capturing a wide range of different tools, information, resources, articles, posts that really got to all three of these things in different ways. One of the things I think we also think is important to understanding this rational, emotional, and creative idea of ourself is knowing that grief can really change your leanings. So you may find that when you're grieving, you're feeling completely out of sorts and overwhelmed, and you don't feel like yourself, and you feel like you're going crazy for all these different reasons. And one of them can be that if we are normally a really, really creative person, grief can bring a halt to our creativity, right? It can just, all of a sudden, maybe that's how we've always expressed ourselves and we've always identified as creative, and then suddenly our grief can just put a cloud over us that stops that creativity, which can be really distressing, and it can be really hard to figure out what that means and how to cope when that part of yourself no longer seems to be what is the most prevalent or most strong at that moment. Same thing, I really relate with my rational self, and grief sometimes is one of those things that takes all reason and practicality and all your analytical thinking and throws it aside, and you become so emotional, and that can really throw a rational person out of sorts when all these emotions are coming up and you're not used to those emotions and feeling them and taking the time to understand and really just sit with those emotions instead of trying to reason them away or understand them away. So I think within this, it's important, and I would encourage everybody who's on the call and who's listening to really think about what your leanings are. You know, of course, we all have a little bit of all of this in us, but you know, for me, I can pretty easily say that I'm probably rational first, creative second, and emotional third. And that I know that when I've been grieving at different points in my life, that order sometimes changes, and you know, the emotional might rise up more. So understanding that, and then also understanding how grief has changed those leanings for you over time, and really thinking about are there ways that has confused and overwhelmed you sometimes to suddenly be pulled into a different direction. So that was really kind of the underpinning of some of this idea was when we really started to relate to these ideas of kind of the rational, the emotional, and the creative. So within kind of these ideas and the call today in our site, I think one of the things that we wanted to do is just flesh out a little bit more what we think each of those areas looks like in terms of the emotional, the creative, and then the rational. What are some things that might work well for people who fall into each of those different categories, and then just some ideas that we've had, things we've blogged about that might be useful to people. So I think that's kind of where we were planning to go.
Sure. Yeah, and I must say, ladies are so brilliant because there is so many books and information about healing grief. But I can't say of all the millions of books that I've read that the griever tries to identify if they're more emotional or more creative or more the left brain rational. Like, okay, if you're kind of more like this, maybe these tools will help. It's more like all these tools and techniques are presented and then see what works for you. So I really like your approach to give people more of a hint what might work for them. So that's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it is hard because there's never a recipe. Like, you just can't know what's going to be right for any one person. But I think for us, this is just from our own experience with ourselves and those we've worked with, just some of the themes that have emerged. And I think it's always been helpful for me to think about it for myself, but also when I'm meeting a new family who I'm working with in grief, trying to get a feel for them and maybe where they might fall in this area, so I best know what tools might be helpful, because it can get overwhelming. Like what you just described, there's all these books and there's all these different ideas and thoughts, and when we're grieving and we're already sort of in overload, trying to sort through what's going to help me or what's not going to help me can be really overwhelming when you realize that if you put in a grief search in Amazon that you've got, thousands of books coming up, or if you're looking at tools and resources, that there's all these different options. So maybe just as a kind of a little bit of structure to that.
Sure. And then let me ask you just one other question before you go through the different types. I imagine with the families you work with, it's almost like you have your family unit, but then you have to help the individuals within the family because they're probably all so different, where maybe this will help the mom, but maybe not so much the son. So I imagine you have to go through that process as well with everyone.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things is for a family to step back and say that we've all experienced this loss that's the same, but we all are experiencing it differently. So, like, I have 5 brothers and sisters, and talking to one about the loss of my mother is totally different than talking to another, just in terms of how they view it, how they cope with it, and just the issues that they still feel like they're working through. And I think with families it can be really hard to see that, and it can be really hard to step back and try and have some compassion for each other's grieving and understanding for our differences. But I think the first step in that is just trying to get everybody to acknowledge that they're all different and everybody needs to grieve in their own way. And then, just looking at the individuals within the unit.
Okay.
And I certainly think that is true, and sometimes we see with families some of the misunderstandings that can come from these individual leanings in different directions. So someone who is extremely emotional and maybe is very comfortable with their emotions and experiencing those emotions around grief, that person may not be able to understand how that rational person in the family is just holding it together, taking care of the practicalities. They want to focus on what are the tasks at hand, what do we need to get done. They might be doers, and they might want to think about their grief maybe more than experiencing those emotions in the same way, which to someone who maybe leans emotionally can appear insensitive, or could appear that they're not feeling a loss on the same level. And I think the same can go a number of different directions. The creative person may really not be able to understand different aspects of the rational or the emotional, the all around. So really taking the time to kind of think through what are the differences in the way that we approach the world and the way that we're approaching this loss can, I think, help us be a little more sympathetic to each other. within a family unit or within, friendships to really try to understand that we're all coping in our own way. So hopefully that sometimes helps our families when we're supporting them through when they start to think through those differences.
Yeah, that's very helpful the way you explained it.
And I think we were going to lay these out a little bit just in sort of thinking through, first and foremost, talking about the emotional, because I do think when we're thinking about grief, even if we're someone who is often creative or rational and really those things are appealing, at its core, grief hits us in that emotional part of ourselves. So, there's this piece of ourselves that is often affected on such a deep level that it brings out emotions that we may have never felt before, or certainly have never felt at the level or the intensity that we're feeling them. And so one of the things that we find and that we often try to talk about in our blog to help normalize the experience for people is that you'll cycle through hundreds of different emotions that are all part of grief. And those emotions can change from day to day, from hour to hour, to minute, and that can be really overwhelming. So even someone who has emotional leanings, who may feel really comfortable with their emotions and feeling those emotions, can really be spiraled into overload when there's so many emotions with so much intensity that people are experiencing. And as you mentioned, in addition to all of that happening within yourself, then it's also happening within your family and all those around you. So it really is kind of this emotional overload. So I think the first part of one of the things that we've talked a lot about and posted a lot about is just learning to be as an emotional griever and that emotional part of our grief that we all have, really learning to cut ourselves a break. And really cut others a break as well, and sort of understand that you're going to feel crazy. You're going to feel a period that's just absolutely overwhelming and almost impossible to articulate to other people. But that's normal, and that rather than trying to avoid that looking for ways that are going to work for you to feel those emotions and let those emotions be something that you process and that you work through is a really important part. And I can speak as someone who has rational leanings, that as a rational griever, it's tempting to just try to explain away those emotions and not want to feel them and not want to sit with them. But really trying to tap into that emotional part of ourselves, and some of the emotional tools can be helpful to make sure that we don't avoid and we don't that we cut ourselves a break and say, I can process these in my own time, and that I should cut others a break to do the same. One of our favorite posts is we wrote a post called "Grief Makes You Crazy," that really was just trying to help people know that is a very normal experience to not know what to make of these emotions, and because you've never been there before, you've never felt it before, that you can think that something's really wrong with you, or that you've really lost it a little bit. So I think that has been a post that a lot of people can relate to. And another one that I wrote that comes to mind too was a post I wrote about having just a complete breakdown in the middle of Target, in the stock aisle at Target. And I'm sure others can relate that there are these triggers that bring out the emotions in us, and you can be anywhere, and suddenly you see something or you hear something that brings out this emotional part of you. And again, as a more rational griever, like crying in Target is not normal for me. So it really took a lot for me to kind of understand that and what that was about me. And sharing it, I think, is really important, because the emotional part of us, I think, wants to connect with the emotional part of others. We want to know that this is normal. And so one of the things that can be helpful when you're feeling these emotions and you're really confused and overwhelmed, I think really is reading memoirs or stories, other people's reflections. I mean, I think sometimes when I'm feeling the most overwhelmed by emotion and wondering, is this normal or am I nuts? You know, reading somebody else's blog post about a similar experience, or reading somebody else's grief memoir where they're echoing some of these same emotions that I'm feeling, can really help us to feel less isolated, more that this is a normal experience, and it can help us understand our own feelings a little bit more when we hear other people who've reflected on them. You know, we can start to reflect on ourselves a little bit better. So I think that that's one of, sometimes people will say, well, what good is it going to do for me to read somebody else's grief story when I'm living this horrible grief story of my own? Why would I want that? But I think there's this real meaningful component of us being able to connect on this emotional level, better understand those emotions. And then from that point, really say, what are the other tools I can use? How can I tap into some of the rational part of myself or the creative part of myself to then start to process those emotions in different ways, and to really, you know, not to sit with those emotions, but then to find other outlets to kind of work through them and process them. So from that point, it can be helpful to look at those other parts of ourselves and the other tools that might work well for the creative and the rational part.
So I wanted to talk real quickly about just using creativity to understand and express some of the emotions around grief, and to communicate even just your experiences with others. And I want to really quickly just throw the caveat out there that I know that creativity can seem kind of intimidating to people who don't feel like artists or real creative types. But there's two facets to being creative, and or to using creativity rather. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to create something. With anything in the creative realm, like art, music, theater, writing, television, and movies, there are people who create, and then there are people who appreciate what was created, the art. And many people do both of those things. And of course, there are varying degrees of both of those things. One of the greatest benefits of art is that it allows the person who is viewing it or listening to it or reading it to project their own understanding and meaning into it. So we're talking about using those creative outlets any way, you know, that works for you. And I also want to say that this includes, we've been talking a lot about movies on the blog. We talk a lot about things like journaling and music. It includes all those sorts of things, like all sorts of mainstream media, things like that. And it helps us to seek meaning and connection with others and understanding, just in the same way that reflections do. So you can find understanding in a song or in a movie, or analyze someone else's experience in a song or a movie. So for those of you who are creators, I think many of you already probably know that art can be a really amazing way to express your feelings and thoughts without having to communicate through those traditional routes of like talk therapy. I'm a talker, but I don't necessarily love to talk about my feelings all the time. So one of the things that has worked for me has been photography. And the reason I choose photography is because I'm not really an artist. I can't actually draw or paint or sculpt or do anything that requires any fine motor skills. But I can click a shutter button on a camera. So it's accessible to everybody. There are forms of creative expression that are accessible to anyone. Just walk through the aisles at Michael's or whatever craft store, and you'll find just how many different ways there are to create something. So we try and simplify things. While we do try and highlight some artists, you know, who are pretty incredible at times when we see them expressing themselves through grief, or expressing their grief through art, we try and kind of simplify it for anybody to be able to use. So we have tutorials on, you know, how to, you know, photograph a symbol, how to use your iPhone to capture things that express your grief. Journaling is something anybody can do, scrapbooking, those sorts of things. And you can do all those things in ways that are literal. So photographing a symbol would be a literal example, or just, writing down exactly how you're feeling at a certain moment, or they can be more abstract. So, the interpretation can be left up to whoever it is who's kind of viewing it. So we really look at it as essentially anything outside of the box that allows you to express yourself or understand yourself in non-traditional ways. And, you may be a more rational person, but you still might be able to appreciate a good song or a good movie. So just, keeping in mind that anything as simple as listening to your favorite, playlist. We have a post about grief playlist, can be therapeutic and helpful. So.
And I think one of the other things that kind of spans the creative into the rational that I wanted to mention is that this can be really helpful when we're talking about being a grieving adult supporting a grieving child. And that is one of the things that can be such a challenge for so many grievers. And it really can require tapping into that rational part of yourself. Because as grief can overwhelm us with emotions, I think so many can relate to that idea of feeling like they need to understand their children, find some tools for their children, and I hate to say hold it together for their children, because we always, of course, want people to feel comfortable showing emotion with their children, but also to be able to really have their emotions enough in control that they can then be an important supportive person for their child. So using some of these tools, like the creative tools, and understanding what they aren't just necessarily helpful for us, but they can really be helpful for our children too, and really giving some different tools for helping kids with grief. A lot of ways that therapy for children works are through things like play therapy and art therapy and things that really allow kids maybe not to directly talk about that loss, but to talk about their emotions and the loss in some more indirect ways. And these different pieces of creative expression can be great for that. And learning about those really starts to tap into the rational part of ourselves. So one of the things that we have on our site is a lot of different creative tutorials of things that you can do with your kids. And we're very lucky that Eleanor has wonderful children who have gotten to, be the guinea pigs of many of the different the different things that we have on our site, but different ways that you can really encourage kids to tap into the emotional and the creative through art and play. And as a parent or as a caregiver, learning about those things for your children can really help you tap into your rational self and take some time, maybe take a break from all of those emotions you're feeling yourself and all of that creative, and really learn about what are some of these tools I can do with my kids and how can we sit down together and do something meaningful. So I would certainly encourage people who have children who are emotional and creative to really look into what those different options are that are out there and learn some of those different tools for kids, because it can be a great way of connecting around the loss. Making art together is always a great thing to do with children. And to kind of go back to the rational, and as I have said, this is the one that I think I always relate to. When we talk about our rational selves, and that's the piece of us that I think wants to understand our own emotions and wants to understand our grief. And some of us lean more towards that than others. But because grief isn't discussed in the mainstream as much as it could be, and because we don't always know a lot about it before we've gone through that grief experience, like Eleanor mentioned, if you try to tap into your rational self and think, what do I know about grief? How can I make sense of this experience I've gone through? many people, the only thing that we know is the 5 stages. You know, we've heard about Kubler-Ross, and we know what that's supposed to look like. And if our grief experience doesn't mimic whatever idea we have of what the 5 stages are or what they mean, then we can really feel abnormal and like somehow maybe our grief is wrong, or it can reinforce that idea that maybe we are kind of going crazy. So for people who are rational grievers and who are really trying to make sense of their emotions and understand more about their loss, we really think it's important to let people know that Kubler-Ross is one of many, many grief theories that are out there, and that there are many other people whose grief theories that you may want to explore and learn about, because you may stumble on one that resonates a lot more with your personal grief experience, or maybe that resonates with the experience of someone around you. So as you read these different theories, you may kind of start to see how they are reflected in maybe your family members or in yourself, and you get that new understanding that grief is so much more than just the 5 stages, and that there are a lot of different theories. So that's one of the reasons for us going back to the site and the things that we thought were important to share on our blog is that we've shared a lot of different articles and posts that we've written about different grief theories. And I know that people are probably thinking that sounds painfully boring and that they might not be excited about going there to check out grief theory. But we really try to keep it at, grief theory less than 101, really the basics of what you need to know about some of these theories, just to start understanding what they say. And then if one of them really speaks to you, or you really think this is great, then you can always go and pick up a book and really dive deeper into understanding that theory. But getting a good overview can at least help you know which resonates with me, which doesn't resonate with me, and do I want to explore this a little bit more. So that can certainly help. The other thing that Eleanor alluded to, and that I think is really important sometimes to tap into our rational self and can help us with understanding our own grief, is really understanding the impact of different types of losses. So Eleanor mentioned that she and our experiences often in supporting grievers is that we are often supporting people who have lost someone in a sudden, traumatic, or unexpected way. And then in our own experiences, we have varying levels of having anticipated losses because someone was very ill, or we saw them suffering with that illness, and we knew where it was, where ultimately things were going. So we're very acutely aware of those differences. I have had another personal loss experience with an overdose death and someone dying from substance abuse. And that had, for me, that experience really opened to my eyes to how different that type of loss can be from other types of losses, and that it brings other components. So really starting to know that there is theory and there is research and there is information about how all of these different types of losses might be impacting your grief. And so, again, this is one of the reasons we felt like it was important to help people understand what type of loss they have experienced, how that might influence their grief, and then how there are specific tools for different losses and different types of losses that may be helpful for addressing some of the certain feelings that people feel that might be unique to an anticipated loss, or unique to a suicide, or unique to an overdose death. So really trying to help people to see and tease out some of those differences can be important, and really tap into your rational self. And I think the other part of our rational self that can be important, and that you mentioned in the intro with talking about practicalities, is that there are just certain things when we're grieving that we have to do. There are just certain things that we can't help but have to take care of, if it's sorting through a loved one's belongings, or dealing with all of those things that go with, settling estates and the kind of things that nobody wants to think about while they're in the height of their grief. And when we're being drawn towards our emotional self, it can be really, really hard to wrap our heads around how we will tackle these rational, analytical, practical things that we need to do. So our experience has been that for a lot of grievers, and certainly for ourselves, having things spelled out is the easiest thing to do. You know, giving really some concrete, practical examples, giving some checklists, giving some really concrete ideas is what people need in order to sometimes tap into the rational self when they need it, in order to get through those things that we have to get through. So we really try to provide some of that on our site, and then there's a lot of other resources for that, some guidebooks on dealing with practicalities after a death that we think can really help people with, getting through those rational things. And lastly, the other thing that maybe sometimes people associate as emotional, but we think in a lot of ways the rational part of ourselves can help us with, is planning for those really tough days, those anniversaries, those holidays, those days that we know are going to be emotional days. We know they're going to be tough. We know our emotional self is probably going to be brought to the forefront. But being prepared for those days and having a plan in advance can really be helpful, and it can help us make those days meaningful. Planning what we want that anniversary to look like, or what we want to do for the holiday to try to make sure that everyone's needs are met, can really be beneficial to everyone grieving. And if we tap into our rational self in advance and really think about what are my options, how do I make a plan, we can sort of have some ideas in place in advance of that day when we know that our emotional self is going to take over. And so we can sort of have a way to let all those emotions come out and let that day be the tough day that it's probably going to be, but do it with some meaningful things that we've decided to incorporate in advance. So we have a lot of tutorial type things on there and lists about what can you do to prepare for these holidays, these anniversaries, these days that everyone knows are going to be difficult, and how can you communicate about it as a family. Some practical tips for communicating, because everybody's idea of what that holiday should look like is probably going to be a little bit different, and everybody's idea of what they want to do for the anniversary is going to be a little bit different. And you don't want to wait for that day where everybody is at the peak of their emotions to sort through what everyone wants that day to look like. But if everybody can sort of spend some time planning for it, really have the most meaningful day that they can to remember their loved one. So I think that those are some of the ways that we think the rational and the creative can kind of be outlets for the emotional. They can sort of help us in different ways to process the emotional and to incorporate our emotions in a way that's going to be really meaningful and help us through our grief, rather than having our emotions be something that we feel just absolutely overwhelmed by, or we feel are really hindering our ability to move forward at all in our grief. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense in those three areas.
Yeah, no, your information is totally helpful. Yeah, and I would encourage the listeners to check out your blog called What's Your Grief, because your blog, too, in addition to all the information you have, it's probably the creative part coming through. It's very inspiring. It's not depressing and, oh, my God, I have to look at this. Yeah, so just that alone helps people lift their spirits, and to hear all your basically, I think, brilliant ideas. So you guys are just, I think, amazing. So, yeah, it was very helpful. And then, and then you were going to tell us, let me back up one moment. I think you had a little free gift for 3 of the listeners, if you want to tell us about that.
Sure, yeah. I one thing that I was just going to add, and that it goes with this, is that we kind of have a subheading to a lot of the things that we talk about understanding that our audience is mostly people who are grieving, but also sometimes people who are just trying to support others. And we have a whole subsection of content about how you can support somebody who's just experienced a loss, and how you can be there for them just throughout their, grieving process. We know that grief lasts far longer than 6 months, a year, and how you can just be a good presence and be a good support for your loved ones and friends. So we have a whole section about that, and we have developed an ebook. It's on Amazon right now, on how to support other individuals who are grieving. So if there's anybody out there who's interested, who has, who wants to get that information, for the future, or if you have somebody in mind who you're hoping to support, the first 3 people who email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com will send a free ebook to through the World Wide Web. So,
yeah, that's awesome. And then you were gonna close us out with a gratitude activity.
You want to do it?
Sure, I can talk about this. For us, one of the things that we talk a lot about is just how we take care of ourselves, and all sorts of different techniques for self-care. We know there are so many hundreds of different ideas out there about ways that you can take care of yourself. But one thing that has been really effective for both Eleanor and I, and that we think really taps into all 3 of the areas we talked about, the rational, the emotional, and the creative, is this idea of gratitude. And for me, something that really resonates with me, and I know it's a pretty trendy concept right now, is the idea of mindfulness. Really taking the time to slow ourselves down and to be present, and to really, even when we're overwhelmed by our emotions and overwhelmed by our grief and our sadness, to really be able to look at our lives and look at the things that we are truly grateful for and the things that we appreciate. And those can be the things that we're grateful for in our relationship with our loved one and the things that we got and we learned from them. Then it can be the things that we're grateful for in our day-to-day life, just every day, the little things that really we have so much appreciation for, but sometimes we're rushing around so much that we don't take the time to think about them. So the idea of seeking gratitude is so easy, and there's so many ways to do it. But what we encourage and what has worked well for us is just every day making a concerted effort to find one thing that you're grateful for and to find some way to express that thing. And the way that you express it can really be based on what works for you. It might be keeping a gratitude journal where every day you just write down that thing that you're grateful for. It might be having a conversation about it at night. Every night before you go to bed, do you and your spouse just take a minute, or you and your kids take a minute to talk about the one thing that day that you're really grateful for? For Eleanor and I, we have both really loved photographing the things that we're grateful for, finding one thing every day to capture our gratitude in a photograph, and really be able to use that as a way to creatively express what we're grateful for. So I'd encourage everybody, even just right now when they're listening to this, to just take a second to reflect on something today that you're grateful for right now. And then, if it's something that you haven't tried before or that seems appealing, to really commit to, from here and going forward, to try to find a daily gratitude and try to find a way to express that gratitude that works for you. It might be putting it on Facebook. It might be tweeting about your daily gratitude. We've definitely done that as well. You can check out some of ours. There's a hashtag, What's Your Gratitude, that we've run on Twitter that has some different gratitudes that we've posted in the past. So we would really encourage people to do that. And if you have any feedback, if you give it a try about how gratitudes are working for you, we would love to hear about it if you visit our blog. And if you do visit the blog, actually, you can see there's a whole chain of posts that we've done that are titled Gratitude. So if you're looking for some inspiration, you can go there to check them out.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I should mention, too, on your blog, the picture of both of you girls is so cute. What was the inspiration behind the photos?
Oh, gosh.
Well, we are, if you saw us right now in this moment, you would know we're the kind of gals who don't put on makeup and wear sweatpants more often than we probably should. So we really struggled with what kind of photo we would do, because we felt like nobody would want to see a photo of us in our usual state. So we were really inspired. We have a coworker who had used this really amazing photographer in Baltimore who does these crazy retro photos, and she had some retro photos done that were inspired when she had cancer, and we thought that something about these retro photos was just so much fun, and really said, we can take grief and we can make it our own. For us, grief wasn't kind of gazing out the window at a sunset or, it was kind of doing crazy stuff that just worked for us. And so we felt like, well, these would be crazy photos. And they would kind of reflect the idea that really we have embraced our creativity and embraced the idea of trying to find what works for us in our grief. And we figured what could be better than some crazy photos to go with that.
Now all the listeners will be sure to go to your site because they'll want to see your photos. And then also, I would encourage the listeners just to read your little short bios, because you have very interesting stories about where your names came from. And I thought maybe the retro pictures had something to do with that because of your namesake. But those are very interesting for people to read as well.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. We both, I think there's something that can be really meaningful about having a name that's connected to your family, and we're both kind of lucky in different ways to have names that mean something to us and that, have carried on in our families in different ways. So.
Yeah, I thought those stories were beautiful. And then last question, and then I'll let you girls go. What, this might be a hard question, but what one message would you like to get out to everyone about loss or coping with grief, or how to go on and live your life fully? Like, what is one thing you'd want everyone to know?
I think that I would just say that there is no normal. So just embrace whatever works for you and whatever works for other people grieving that loss. Don't expect it to follow a timeline. Don't expect, the tools that worked for someone sitting next to you at church to work for you the same way. We're all unique, and so is grief. So just, don't worry about whether you're doing the right things. As long as you're dealing, you'll get there.
Oh, she sums that up so well. I don't know if I can top that off. But I think the one thing I would say, and this isn't going to be right for everybody, it's not going to be right for the people who maybe don't feel comfortable just talking about their grief, but find some way to express your grief and connect with others. I think one of the things that can be most difficult for grievers is that we feel so isolated, and we keep grief in the shadows because we don't want to talk about it, and we don't want to necessarily share that. But I can't count how many times when I've shared my own experience with grief that then that person who, didn't know me that well might decide to then open up about their own experience. And we find out the more that we do that, the more that we're all in this together, and that so many of us have had grief experiences. So I think the more that we can share with each other, the more we'll create a culture and a society that will really be more embracing and understanding of grief, and that will really allow us all a better environment to grieve in.
Yeah, and that's really what you ladies are doing through your site, through your education and openness. So I congratulate you. Kudos to you, and thanks again for sharing all your wonderful information with us. And then also I should mention to everyone on the call if you this recording will be available up to 48 hours later. So if you want to listen to it again, because there was a lot of tips in here that were quite helpful. So thanks again, lady, and take care, everyone who is on the call. And we'll look forward to chatting with you for our next speaker.